Good afternoon. So my name is Enzo. You don't have to know how to pronounce my family name, that's fine. We've heard about the talk about open source and standards before by Italo. Then we've heard about, and that was very true, and I will talk about standards as well and how important they are and their relationship with regulation just in a couple of slides, probably three. And then we just heard about Axel about at the national level, what are the policies to promote open source, right? What are the connections with concepts like digital sovereignty, et cetera, et cetera. But there is another part of open source facing, say, state authority or regulatory challenges, which is compliance with regulation that are literally encompassing and mentioning open source as a technology that needs to comply with European regulation. So that's what we mean. So my name is Enzo. I work as Associate Director in European Policy at the Eclipse Foundation. And so often what I have to do is to explain what my job is. I do this all the time because most of the time I have a hard time explaining what I actually do for a living. And so therefore, why am I talking? What am I talking about? So here, that should give you an understanding of what I actually do instead of what my family thinks, which is me hanging out in some sort of lobby in the European Parliament where I do shady stuff, like in House of Cards. This is what my boss thinks I'm doing, despite me reporting to him. He thinks that I wear a suit and I smile and I shake hands and kiss babies. And this is what I'm actually doing, which is just reading a bunch of legal documents, make sure that I can send the right inputs, the right amendments to policymakers, because of exactly what Italo said just something like 45 minutes ago. There are many lobbies in Brussels, at the European level, that go around and lobby for closed source technology. So if they do this, how can the open source community do a similar thing so that policymakers have all the information in front of them when they have to take a decision? If they have to take a technology decision, if they have to discuss interoperability, how do we give them the right technological understanding with words that they actually understand so that they can take a fair decision that is sort of enlightened by the real technical issues? So that's my daily job. Now, how did I end up there? Before, I used to work in the public sector, specifically in the European Commission. After that, I worked in a very large tech company. So if you remember the presentation from Italo, you see all the large companies. This is actually where I've learned to do my job. And as my parents generally say, I've tried to buy myself a new soul by now working in the open source sector. So not for big tech, but for open source values, principles, licenses, etc., etc. So now, the real topic, what are the regulations and what are the challenges, right? We're going to have new regulations applicable to LibreOffice, applicable to the software that we have in Eclipse. Think about whatever Eclipse software that you know. We're also going to have to comply. And that's true for Linux, that's true for any software that is used in Europe, that is from Apache, whatever. So what are the challenges? These are all the existing digital regulation in Europe at the European level. All of them. This is whatever regulation you can think of in Europe, they are listed in this. It's written very small, right? And so you can't really read. It's on purpose. It's to explain to you how complicated it will be to comply with all of this. Because even me as someone that has competence in law and a degree in law and has studied law and is still exercising law in many aspects, this is too complicated, it's too messy, it's too small, there's too many texts to read. But now, this, in orange, it's everything that has been adopted in the last 5 years. So all of this is all the body of law that we have to comply with, and everything in orange, which is something around 65%, has been adopted only in the last 5 years. This is to explain how big the job that we have to do is. Now, it's not going to be that big. I kind of tried to scare you a little bit. These are the 3 regulations that actually mention open source directly. There are 3. One of them is called the Product Liability Directive. It hasn't been published yet. It's probably going to be subjected to some change. So let's not talk about it too much today. And there is another one that is called the AI Act. This one, there is a huge debate because even the definition of open source AI that is listed in the text is not exactly clear right now. But then there is a last one that has been literally adopted something like 45 minutes ago. That is called the Cyber Resilience Act. that it's an act about cybersecurity of product with digital elements. What does it mean? It means every single digital product, including software. So think about any object that you have that has a digital element into it. It's connected, it's IoT, whatever. It's part of this. If it has a software in it, or if it's just a software, it's a service, it has to comply with the Cyber Resilience Act. So, what the hell is the Cyber Resilience Act? If you want to know all of this, we have already created within the Eclipse Foundation, together with the European institution, a bunch of materials that would help you to read the CRA, meaning CRA, Cyber Resilience Act, CRA. They're going to help you to read super quickly the CRA, meaning CRA is 400 pages. You don't want to read the 400 pages, trust me. But we can teach you how to read it very quickly so that you know where to look at it. Then an introduction to the open source obligation within the CRA. And then finally, and that's what we're going to talk about the most after, the standards element within the CRA. Exactly what Italo mentioned before. There's a slight difference, is that standards matter for CRA for one reason. If you apply the standards, there is what we call a presumption of conformity, meaning you don't need to go through everything. You can just adopt the standards. You're considered being in compliance. That's where the fight and the challenge is. And then there is some others coming. So, what is CRA? I'm going to try to be very quick, otherwise I can spend hours talking about those 300 or 400 pages of documents. But in a very, very short and a super tiny nutshell, this is communication materials from the Commission. The Commission considers that right now, digital elements, or a product with digital elements, are like cheese, or a very famous European cheese with a bunch of holes in it. And the CRA is supposed to help by monitoring the supply chain and checking the supply chain so that we can fill those holes and the products are more secure. I'm not giving my opinion, I'm just saying this is how the Commission communicates about it. In details, this means what products and software are in scope. Hardware products, including components, placed on the market. Think about laptops, smart appliances, mobiles, etc. Software products, including components or software components that are placed on the market. Operating system, word processing, games, mobile apps, software libraries, everything, including the remote data processing solution, so SaaS. Now, what's outside the scope? You tell me if it's clear. Non-commercial products. So hobby products, if someone is developing something in his garage just because it's fun, it's supposed to be excluded. Services, in particular standalone SaaS, not just SaaS, because it's covered by another regulation. And there are other outright exclusion, cars, medical device, for the simple reason that the security of car is considered so important that it has its own cybersecurity legislation. Same for medical devices because of privacy, personal data. Healthcare is a sensitive topic. They have a different legislation that is even harder to comply with. Now, I think you, like me, you don't really know what it means. If my software is my LibreOffice in scope, is some of the Eclipse Foundation software in scope, we don't know. So the Commission told us this. This is the scheme that you're supposed to follow. Are you providing FOSS or merely contributing? If you're merely contributing, you're not in scope. You don't have to comply with anything. If you provide the software, there is a second question. Are you developing in the course of a commercial activity? In the broad sense, is there somewhere a commercial activity that you do when you provide that software? If no, zero, nothing, you're not supposed to be in scope. If yes, are you directly monetizing the project? If you're directly monetizing the project, you are considered the manufacturer of the project. Then you will have obligation. That's why it's green. You are a manufacturer, you have to comply. If you don't directly monetize the project, for example, the Eclipse Foundation doesn't monetize any of its services, LibreOffice doesn't monetize its services, then you're considered a legal person providing support and you are a steward. If you do none of this, you're not in scope. You don't have to do anything. Another thing, and that's the last thing about the CRA, after that we talk about the real stuff, or the funniest stuff, the sharing of responsibility. That's what the CRA is saying. So think about it of how do we share the responsibilities between LibreOffice and the companies that are contributing to LibreOffice, or the governments or companies that are implementing
LibreOffice in their supply chain into one of their products. The Commission created, and the other legislators, like the Parliament, created what they call a sharing of responsibility for cybersecurity. In what words? It means, if I am a company, so the company is the little phone over there. If I found a vulnerability in the software, I am forced to report the vulnerability to LibreOffice. LibreOffice is forced to reply to the company to say, okay, we received the fact that you found a vulnerability, and the company is forced, if they solve the vulnerability, to report their solution to LibreOffice, right? So there has to be an exchange between the stewards, LibreOffice, and the manufacturer that is providing a cybersecurity patch or whatever, the solution for cybersecurity that they found. Now, the steward has another obligation, which is, and you tell me if it's clear to you, this is the obligation. They have to put in place, so LibreOffice has to put in place a cybersecurity policy taking into account the specific nature of the open source steward. So Eclipse is a steward, LibreOffice is a steward. It has to take into account its own nature. Cooperate with market surveillance authorities. Think of market surveillance authority as an authority that will be checking every single one of your projects, and if you don't comply, they hit you with a fine. So you have to cooperate with them as a steward. And you have to report incidents and vulnerabilities to the community, to the public, to the extent that they're involved in the development process. So LibreOffice. So this is the overview of all the obligations. Manufacturers have to comply with a bunch of cybersecurity requirements. Stewards have to do a few things, and they need to cooperate with each other. They need to talk. They need to exchange information. Now, I'm sorry it's very long, but it's very important so that we can talk about the real thing after. There are 4 obligations in the text, 4 articles that really matter if you want to talk about the CRA. 1, Article 13. Manufacturers have to exercise due diligence. They need to check. They can't just integrate whatever components it's out there. They have the obligation to check what components they have inside. The Article 27 is the one I mentioned before about presumption of conformity. A company can say, my product is in line with the CRA, my open source product is in line with the CRA because I have adopted the standards for cybersecurity. Boom, I'm in compliance. I don't have to think, I don't have to apply things that are very complicated, I don't have to do much more. I have adopted the standard. Easy compliance. On Article 25, there is something called a security attestation program that stewards or company can apply to open source components. If you adopt this, you're considered in compliance with the CRA. Finally, the Commission will publish a guidance in order to support us in complying with the CRA. So these are the tools that are supposed to help us to comply with the CRA. Now, this is what the Commission is telling us. This is what you can read in the text, but it's not really clear to me, at least. Maybe for you guys it's very clear. You tell me if it's clear. So what are they not talking about? What we don't know? What manufacturers should be doing so that it qualifies as due diligence? What is due diligence to you? Maybe in the room we all have a different definition of what is due diligence. I used to work for a project that helps businesses to have relationship with Chinese manufacturers. Due diligence to us is to check if they even administratively exist in China. If they don't exist, then we don't do business with them. Is it enough for due diligence? Do I have to check that there is an entity behind? Nobody knows. How is the open source community supposed to participate into building standards? Can we just use open standards that Italo mentioned before? I mean, Italo mentioned something specific to documents, but if there is an open standard related to security of software before, is it enough? Can I just use the open standards? We don't know. What cybersecurity policy should be adopted by LibreOffice so that it's considered as a cybersecurity policy that allows you to comply with the CRA? We don't know. Nobody knows. It's not written in the text. You remember it says you have to cooperate with market surveillance authority. What does it mean? Does it mean that I have to respond to the email? Do I have to respond to it in 1 week? In 1 month, in 72 hours, 48 hours? If I do it in 1 week, do they consider that I did not cooperate so they can find the organization? Nobody knows. And then we have the guidance, right? Supposed to help us. What is going to be in the guidance? We don't know. So now, what do we do with this? How do we address those challenges? We don't know what's going to be in the guidance. We don't know what standards to adopt. We don't know how much we have to cooperate with market surveillance authorities. So how do we address all of this? There is only one answer to all of these questions. It's working together. It's cooperating into defining something that we can force the regulators, we can push the market surveillance authorities into recognizing that what we do is considered as secure enough so that it's in compliance with the CRA obligations. So, I give you 4 examples on things that we can work together. First, participating in standards setting. So you remember I told you before, is the open standards, like Italo mentioned this morning, is going to be enough to comply with the CRA? I told you we don't know. The reality is kind of we know. It's not going to be possible. Because open standards do not allow regulatory compliance. The only way that an open standards can allow regulatory compliance is if an open standard is recognized by something called a European Standardization Organization. Think about it as a body that can register standards so that the government feels like it's okay to rely on those standards. The problem being that ISOs in Europe, there are 3, CEN, CENELEC, and ETSI, they're mostly dominated by proprietary software companies. So now the question is, how does the open source community is going to contribute to something they never contributed to before, which is the ESOs that I mentioned before. This costs money. If you want to be a member of ETSI, you need to pay something like 10K. So, is LibreOffice going to pay 10K and then hire a professional in standards so that they can fight for whatever standards they want to apply? Is Eclipse Foundation going to do the same? OW2 in France? What are they going to do? We don't know. So working together is the solution, the same way that we develop software together, we work on standards together, and we fight for those standards inside the standardization bodies. The second one is drafting specification. So if a foundation or 2 foundations or 3 foundations get together and they say, okay, these are the cybersecurity policies that we want to apply, then they can go to the European institutions and say, hey, this is our specification, this is what we think is secure. Can you please recognize such processes, such specification in order for us to comply? Then, if we don't know what's going to be in the guidance, maybe it's an opportunity more than a problem. Maybe the problem is not that we don't know what's going to be in the guidance, but it's an opportunity for us to write an idea of what should be in the guidance and send it to all the policymakers that we know and tell them, well, we are the expert, we have a technical expertise on cybersecurity, we know how cybersecurity of digital product functions, we know how cybersecurity of software functions. Maybe by drafting the guidance, sending it to them and asking them what they think of this could be a way of working. That's typically what super large companies are doing. They go to the Department of Cybersecurity, they drafted the guidance for the policymakers, and they send the guidance to the policymakers, and sometimes they look at it, they feel it's good enough, and they just adopt it. Finally, same thing for the attestation that I mentioned before. Guidance and attestations are going to be the 2 tools that are the most useful for a steward like a LibreOffice or for any organization that wants to implement open source in its supply chain. Basically, pretty much every company, right? So maybe if we draft what should be in an attestation and then we send it to policymakers, then they will be forced to listen to it. And when I say maybe, in my experience, and I explained to you what was my daily job before, you see the picture of me struggling with all the papers and all the deadlines. Policymakers are in the same situation. They also have deadlines, they also have inputs, they also have a lot of legal documents. So sending them a document that has technical expertise behind and the legitimacy of a lot of experts in the open source community is helping them to meet these deadlines. So now what can we do? We set up a place to work together on building different specifications. Originally, what happened is my executive director in the Eclipse Foundation was like, what the fuck are we going to do with compliance with CRA? We have no idea how to do it. And then they sat down with the equivalent at Apache Foundation, and they were like, we also have no fucking idea how we're going to comply with this. And they decided, what if we set up something so that we develop specification? And then from that day, we started to call, other foundations, we started to call companies, et cetera, and try to ask them, hey, do you want to, make a pool of money, and then we can pay for the membership in this standards organization. We can hire people that can work for standards and fight for standards for the open source community. And then maybe we have a chance to have easy compliance with the CRA rather than struggling. So far, 18 foundations have joined us into doing this. TDF is one of them. 3 weeks ago, we also managed to announce that 4 large companies joined us, or 3 or 4, I don't remember, joined us in this because we need budget, right? I don't know for LibreOffice, but Eclipse Foundation has limited resources. We can't be paying for everything. And so Nokia, Mercedes, Bosch, and there is a 4th one, but I can't remember the name. They also say they want to be a member. They also decided to give us a bit of money, and then we're going to start working on this with head of cybersecurities, professional in standards, professional of policy making as well. What we plan to do is this. We plan to build specifications that we can send to ISO, CEN, CENELEC, that will be based on unified practices of the open source ecosystem, cybersecurity best practices, OSS supply chain security best practices, vulnerability management best practices. We're going to get them together, check the box, and what comes out of the box, we're going to submit it to CEN, CENELEC, ISO, etc., build these standards, and then we're going to fight for these standards to be recognized by the institutions so that we can easily comply. The thing is, in order to do that, we need the open source community to get together. We need to actually work together on all of this. We need to find the companies that make money with different open source components, make them understand that this matters to them. We need to go to the leaders of the open source community, explain to them that this matters, otherwise they can't distribute the software anymore and nobody's going to rely on their software in Europe anymore. And then once we manage to pull all these people together, then maybe we're going to be able to do our work. So it's working together. Thank you very much for your time, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. Thank you.